I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to episode 119 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. Today we have an interview with Casey Sepp, the author of
Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee.
Casey Sepp is a proud graduate of the Talbot County Public Schools. She has an A.B. from Harvard College and a Master's of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She was born and raised on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where she still lives with her family. She is a staff writer at The New Yorker, and her first book, Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee, was an instant New York Times bestseller and is available in hardcover as an ebook and as an audiobook. The Reverend Willie Maxwell was a rural preacher accused of murdering 5 of his family members for insurance money in the 1970s. With the help of a savvy lawyer, he escaped justice for years until a relative shot him dead at the funeral of his last victim. Despite hundreds of witnesses, Maxwell's murderer was acquitted, thanks to the same attorney who had previously defended the Reverend.
We would like to welcome another Agatha nominee. Casey Sepp was nominated for Best Nonfiction. Welcome, Casey.
Thanks so much for having me.
All in all, To Kill a Mockingbird could be told based on today's life as well as the original story. What do you think Harper Lee would feel about today's internet mentality?
I think that's an interesting question. It's hard to remember because To Kill a Mockingbird was published in 1960, but it's set during the Great Depression. So it felt old even when it first came out. And of course, now here we are more than 50 years later. So it can feel quite dated in some ways based on the Depression plot and how people are living. But of course, you're right to point out that so much of the story feels contemporary because it's a story about accusations against people, about the failures of the criminal justice system, about the mysteries of childhood, about how we make sense of our parents and our neighbors when we're young and uninformed. That all feels the same with or without the internet, although I suspect what you're wondering about is, does the internet make some of these things worse? Obviously, the internet and social media have been around long enough now that we've seen stories of the way that mobs can assemble online and attack people, innocent or guilty people. I think Harper Lee would have been interested in that. She was kind of a Luddite. She didn't want To Kill a Mockingbird to be published as an ebook. She never used a computer. In fact, one of the funniest stories I tell in the book is she literally stopped going to the New York Public Library when they digitized their card catalog because she wanted to be able to go look through the physical cards if she was looking for a book. So she switched to the Society Library uptown. I don't know that she would have much participated in the internet, but I think she would have been fascinated by it. There are all these true crime podcasts. She was totally obsessed with crimes. I think she would have been a consumer of some of the cultural stuff, but probably would not have had a Facebook or a Twitter or an Instagram.
Because there wasn't another book after To Kill a Mockingbird until Go Set a Watchman, and she was a very private person, Harper Lee comes off as quite a mysterious character. After your research, can you give us a more complete description of her?
Sure thing. She was mysterious unto me. I started working on this book and originally got interested in her life story because I love To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think like most people, I wondered, what the heck did she do after that? She lived until 2016, so there were all these kind of unaccounted for decades. She was very private, pathologically so. Unfortunately for her, she did the thing you shouldn't do if you don't want people interested in your life, which is keep quiet because it only made them more interested. I think that what I was able to do in Furious Hours is not illuminate every minute of every day of her life, but there's certainly a lot more of what she was up to. And I think in some ways, when you say, can I give a complete description of her, it's a tall order for anyone, especially someone as private as Harper Lee. But I guess what I'll say is there were some things I learned. I learned she was interested in crime, and it was a persistent and lifelong interest. She would track cases in the newspaper, and she would gossip about them with friends. She did have friends. She had friends and family, and so the idea that she was reclusive, I think, is a really incomplete description. It's true that she was private, but she also did have friends, and she was gregarious and social when she wanted to be. So I think the book is filled with stories like that, her showing up at a bar or a restaurant, being introduced to someone and really performing and impressing them. She was cosmopolitan and witty and an intellectual, and I think that those are aspects of her personality that are suppressed for the sake of the kind of brooding, mysterious woman. Not that that's complete, but certainly she was more complicated than I think the image of recluse or one-hit wonder people have, because of course the other straightforward thing to say is she kept writing. She didn't publish, but she kept writing. And the case at the heart of my book is a case that she spent almost a year researching in situ in the town in Alabama where these murders had taken place, and many years after that trying to shape it into a book. So I think probably the most essential thing to complete our picture of her is realizing that she was a writer through and through, and just because she wasn't publishing didn't mean she wasn't trying to write.
What would you say is the most surprising thing you learned about her?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I admired her a great deal. So it's difficult when you set out to write about someone you admire so much, because of course you might be surprised by things you don't like. But in the case of Harper Lee, I think it really was just, I said she was cosmopolitan, and I meant it. And I told a story a few minutes ago about how she stopped using the New York Public Library. And I think very straightforwardly, the thing I learned is she was every bit as much a New Yorker as an Alabamian. And probably a lot of folks listening like me so strongly associate her with Alabama because of the novels she wrote. But she actually lived most of her adult life on the Upper East Side. She had moved to New York after dropping out of law school. She went home to Alabama, and she had friends and family there that she visited quite regularly, but she was basically a New Yorker. That meant she was having cocktails at Elaine's, she was going to the public library, she was looking at art exhibits at the Frick, going to baseball games at Shea Stadium, and I think that was incredibly surprising to me because I, like a lot of people, just think of her as a small-town Alabamian, and instead she's getting on the subway to go visit Herman Melville's grave. So I think that was definitely surprising for me and a lot of fun because I got to meet some of her New York friends and learn a lot more about her New York life.
Well, it sounds to me like she was very adaptable.
Yeah, I think that's true. In some ways, I think it can be a little hard to bring to life today because we all travel more. It's a global world, and you get on an airplane one day and you're in another country the next. It's easy to forget that Harper Lee's experience was basically growing up in a town of a few thousand people. The bravest thing she was supposed to do was to go to Tuscaloosa for university. She did that, but when she dropped out, she moved to New York, where she hardly knew anyone. As far as her friends and family in that small town in Alabama were concerned, she might as well have moved to Hades. Like, it was so far away, it was so big, it was so far into their experience that she certainly was adaptable. Here was a young woman who just really leaned into her New York life, wrote a bestseller and won a Pulitzer, really just changed her circumstances.
Speaking of her going off to college, you do share some traits with her as far as you're both from small towns and you both left to go to college and then returned. Did you ever get a chance to meet her, and do you feel a kinship to her?
That's a very flattering comparison, and I will take it. I never met her. She died in 2016. I had just started working on this all in 2015. Actually, I said she was a lifelong New Yorker. She had a pretty serious stroke about 9 years before she died, and she moved home to Alabama and lived in an assisted living facility. She never really fully recovered from that stroke. So very few people got in to see her, and in ways that are understandable, she aged into even more privacy than she'd pursued as an adult. as a writer in her prime. So I never met her, but yes, of course, I loved To Kill a Mockingbird as a kid for exactly that reason. I think like a lot of small town nerds and Daddy's Girls, Scout was just a tremendously interesting character for me, and I was interested in her life, and it felt similar to mine. And it's actually the origins of the book was pure fandom. I had always wanted to see Monroeville, which is the little town in the Black Belt where Harper Lee was born and raised. It's the model for Macomb. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but they're quite similar, and the world building she was doing was very autobiographical. So like a lot of fans of the novel, I'd always wanted to go. And when the publication of Go Set a Watchman was announced, I jumped at the chance to go down, and I wrote a story about that for the New Yorker because, of course, I think this is one of the things that you guys wanted to talk about, but that book was a tremendously controversial book, and there were a lot of questions about Harper Lee's ability to consent and about the publication of the origins of Furious Hours. This true crime book I wrote really have everything to do with the publication of that novel and the kind of stewardship of Harper Lee's affairs.
Continuing in that vein, what do you believe were her intentions regarding Go Set a Watchman?
I think intentionality is a tricky thing. You guys mentioned the Agatha Award, and let's be honest, it's a little bit of a locked room mystery what any author wants and what their intentions are about their work. In the case of Go Set a Watchman, it's even trickier because I think contrary to the way it was presented to the public, it's important to remember what that novel was. That novel was a draft of To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's the very first version of the story Harper Lee ever wrote. So it's certainly true that in 1957, when she happily and eagerly delivered it to her agents in New York City near the New York Public Library, she was dying to be published and would have sold her soul for someone to put out that novel. This is a draft of the book that when she submitted it, no publisher would publish. Instead, a female editor at a publishing house called Lippincott read Go Set a Watchman and said, I love this world and I'm interested in these characters. I can't publish this novel, but I want to help you write a novel that we can publish. And so the two of them over a 2.5-year period worked on To Kill a Mockingbird. And that was a lot of revision. That was a lot of reimagining. If you've read the two novels, you can see some of the structural and aesthetic decisions that were made. And it was a wonderful collaboration. So at some point in her life, Harper Lee did very much want Go Set a Watchman to be published. And the question, of course, is 60 years later, was that still the case? I actually remain really humbled by the reporting. There are real disagreements among Harper Lee's friends and family, and it was contentious even within her small circle of connections, and even more contentious in the wider literary world. So I think it's very hard to know what she herself wanted. And of course, then there's the added question of, were her desires actionable? Because of course, for some people, it doesn't matter what she was saying at the end of her life. They feel that she was impaired in a way that meant she couldn't actively participate in those decisions. They think that she had undiagnosed dementia or that she was being manipulated by some of the people who were overseeing her affairs. So I think that's an open question still. But what I will say is, no matter what she wanted, being that this book was put into the world, I just wish it had been done a little differently. And I quote a lot of letters in my book that Harper Lee wrote, and I add a lot of history to her life, contextual history about Southern politics and about her experience as a writer. I think Go Set a Watchman could have benefited from a different approach. If the novel had been put out and they had included letters Harper Lee had written in the 50s when she was trying to become a writer, and some of the publishing history about how this manuscript was rejected but revised, and even just the context, there are certain scenes and bits of dialogue and kind of scenarios that were preserved in To Kill a Mockingbird. You could have really created a fuller and more interesting and more complicated experience for readers if you had published it differently. I think it was really grievous to just say, oh, there's a new book from Harper Lee, because of course the new book was the oldest one she'd ever written. It was not a sequel that she had labored over for decades and that she wanted to put out at 89 years of age. It was a very old book that had been rediscovered and that should have been published as such. There's this primary question of, did she want it published? And the secondary one is, well, if we're going to publish it, how should we do that in a way that teaches readers the most about her career and that presents the project she was invested in? I think had they done that, there wouldn't have been so many people who, it sounds like you guys, didn't want to read it at all, or who read it and decided, oh, Harper Lee wasn't as good a writer as I thought. which of course is a reasonable thing to think. Go Set a Watchman is a more politically complicated novel, but a less sophisticated one in some ways, and just less beautiful than To Kill a Mockingbird. So plenty of people who read it thought, oh gosh, well, she really became a worse writer. When in fact, this is a draft. It was the first thing she ever wrote. She'd never published anything when she submitted Go Set a Watchman. So I just wish it had all unfolded a little differently.
I had a very interesting conversation with my son last night who had to read To Kill a Mockingbird for high school. They got into a discussion about Go Set a Watchman. His teacher said that she felt that she wanted Atticus to be not the superhero he was in Mockingbird, that she wanted him to be more human. It was a more accurate depiction of what she saw Atticus as in Go Set a Watchman.
I don't think your son's teacher was wrong.